Awesome. So let's get started with this conversation. Maybe a couple of quick words about my background. I am a certified Scrum trainer professionally, a certified product innovation trainer, and a SAFe program consultant. I've been in the digital product management space for pretty much my career, working for large companies, big companies between Italy and the United States. And most recently, I I started and I run a consulting and training company based in Washington, D.C., and we help organizations learn and adopt agile and product management practices. So today we are going to talk about user stories, and in particular, I would like to cover 4 different areas. The first one is why user stories. I'm going to give for granted that participants here know about user stories. I'm not going to cover the foundation or the basics of user stories. I would like to take it to the next step. Let's try to understand how to use them properly. Then the second piece is the splitting user stories techniques. We're going to look at how to take big stories into smaller ones. In part 3, we will talk about other story formats because the user story format is not the only one available. And then in part 4, I'm going to give you some tips about acceptance criteria, how to use them effectively. To get started with the first topic, why user stories, I want to share, just as a kind of to ground our conversation, let me share this story. As an international traveler, waiting in the airport, I want to receive an alert when it's time to board my plane so that I can do shopping in the airport while waiting and I don't risk losing my flight. This is a user story. This is maybe a new feature or a new functionality that a website like Expedia or another travel website may want to implement in their system to support people that are waiting in the airport. And this is as good as a user story it needs to be in order to describe what is it that we need to do, why that matters, why that is important, and for what kind of user we want to build it, why does it matter. So the story format, just a quick refresher for everybody, has 3 components. The user story format has 3 components. As a type of user, I want to do something so that I get an outcome or a benefit. And if you're familiar with the user story format, you remember that the first part basically describes who is the user. The second part is what the user wants to do with the system or with the feature that we are talking about. And the third piece is why it matters to the user. What is it that they want to get out of it? So what is the benefit? A user story always has 3 pieces in support of the 3 C's. It sparks a conversation, it's written on a card, so it's not a long document, it's written on a card, and it has a confirmation part. We will talk more about the confirmation part when we talk about the acceptance criteria later on today. And the INVEST criteria, so this 6-letter acronym, INVEST, may be a good framework, a good mental reminder for checking in whether a story is actually well written or maybe is not. So a story needs to be independent. We need to be able to work on that feature or functionality, build it, and deliver to the user so that they can use it regardless of anything else. Negotiable, it doesn't fix the solution up front, but the solution may emerge from that conversation. It needs to be valuable or vertical, meaning that it needs to deliver some value when it's done so that the users can actually use it and get value out of it. For that, it needs to be vertical and not horizontal. We will talk about that in a bit. Estimable, it means that we need to be able to estimate that. Sometimes a story may be too big, too complex, too fuzzy it's hard to grasp the level of effort. Maybe we need to split it into smaller stories before we can estimate. And then smaller stories are better than larger ones because they are easier to plan, and also they will flow through the system in a faster way, so we improve our productivity. And then finally, it needs to be testable. We need to have a way to test whether or not what we have built actually satisfies the customer needs and delivers that benefit that we were talking about in the user story format. All right, so that was a quick overview. Let's get to talk about some typical problems that happen when product owners use user stories or they don't use them properly. So the first problem is that the user is not specific. Using the word user in a user story is not a good practice. The reason is that the first component, the who of a user story format, is designed to give a context, give background, give maybe even situational background about who the user really is and what is the user doing in the situation where they need that user story. So instead of using the word user, in an example of a website, we could say a returning customer to our website. Now the context is much more clear. Or a new customer who has just registered. Sometimes we have user personas. User personas are great for creating context about who the user is and what they need. So you may even use a user persona, for example, Mary or Larry, in your user story. That will create great context about who the user really is. Second problem, the user should not be the one doing the work. This is not about the developers, it's not about the tester or the UI designer. So sometimes I see a user story written as a developer, I want to do something so that my customers can take whatever action on that. That's not a proper user story, because the user story is always from the end user point of view, is not from the people doing the work. And the same thing is true for the product owner. So writing a user story as a product owner, I want something, that also is a no-no, because the product owner is not the end user. Again, we should focus on the end user instead. So, for example, a good way to create a user story would be to be specific about who the user really is. And an example is this: as a returning customer to the website, I want to say my login credentials so that I don't need to re-enter my password every time I come back to the website. And one check you can do to see whether the story works is the user, so the who, and the benefit, that's the why, they need to be connected. The person getting the benefit is the user in the user story. If it's not, then something is off. Why is that important? Because good user stories are user-centric. The focus is on the user and their goals. The user story captures the essence of what the user needs and how it will benefit them. In fact, effective user stories describe what the user can do, not what the product should do. Notice the difference. We want to describe what the user can do, not what the product should do. So it's always user-centric from the point of view of the user. And then user stories explicitly define the value or the outcome the users are going to get from the work of the developers. This is important because at the end, the product owner will have to prioritize the product backlog. And typically, one of the most important criteria for the product owner to prioritize the product backlog is to do that based on value. Value to the customer and value to the business. And when user stories do not clearly specify the value, it's actually hard to grasp whether or not this is a priority. So using the user story format properly also helps the product owner in understanding what to prioritize. All right. So there are some examples of course, bad user stories. And I would like to share a few of these just for the conversation today. And let's get started with a couple of examples. So for example, a story that is vague or unspecific, that is not very useful. For example, as a user, I want the system to be faster. What does it mean? What does it mean to be faster? Is like 1% faster or 50% faster, first of all. But also faster, what is it that we need to do in order to make it faster is not clear. And I would say that the speed of a system, so the system being faster, is not something that we need to do, but is more like a property of the system. So that really is a non-functional requirement more than a user story. System-driven. Effective user stories describe what the user does, not what the product should do. In fact, an example is this. The system should automatically generate reports. That is what the system should do. But what about the user? Why does the user need reports that are automatically generated? So we want to always focus on the people, the user who needs the report and why it is important for them. Another example of a bad user story is one that is focused on technical detail. As a developer, I want to use a new framework X so that I can code more efficiently. Actually, there are a few things here that are wrong in this user story. One is that it's written from the developer point of view, and that's not the end user. We spoke about that earlier. But also this is a story that describes an internal activity, something that the developers need to do in order to improve their own code, their own work environment. And while this could be a good thing to do, a good technical solution, it is not the user story. It's not something that we are doing for the user, at least not explicitly. So using a user story format to describe this type of work is actually not a good practice. We should use a different format called the system story. We will look at that in a little bit. And then finally, unrealistic or subjective. As a customer, I want the app to have an amazing graphics so that everyone will want to use it. Great, aspirational, awesome goal, but it doesn't provide any concrete functionality. It's not something that the user can use, and it doesn't describe actually what does it mean to deliver that amazing graphics. So I would consider this more like an NFR, non-functional requirement, but even that, the NFRs should be objective so we can test them. So that probably requires a little bit of detail to be more clear about what it is that we need to do. So let's see a few other examples here. In this case, so let's say this story, as a Netflix subscriber, this is a Netflix example, as a Netflix subscriber looking for a new movie to watch, I want the system to give me 10 suggestions that are pulled from the watch history database using a recommendation score of 1 to 100 to identify the best recommendations. And then there is a benefit so that I can choose my next movie to watch. In this user story, if you really look a little deeper inside what is the what part of the user story, there are a lot of technical details that specify the solution. For example, the pulling from the watch history database or using a recommendation score of 1 to 100 and so on. While these could be good ideas, it may not be the only technical details that actually will make this story successful, or the only options that we have available. Maybe a different scoring model could be better than this one. So now when we fix the solution into the user story, now we don't leave any room for exploration, experimentation, or innovation. So what we really should be doing is explain what the story, what the user wants to get, not how we are going to do it, and then delegate the how to later, to that conversation that happens with the developers, because out of the conversation may come up additional technical details or best practices to actually implement that more effectively. So for example, this new version of that story is better because it's negotiable. So as a Netflix subscriber looking for a new movie to watch, I want to see a list of recommendations based on my watch history so that I can choose my next movie to watch. Now we can add some acceptance criteria, things that may be important for us to test and validate. For example, the user can see 10 recommendations, and then the recommendations are sorted best to worst. These are important to deliver the right user experience. So we want to formalize those acceptance criteria. But in terms of the actual details of how we're going to build it, what kind of algorithm, what kind of database table, what kind of scoring model, and so on, that doesn't go in the user story. It will come up in the conversation with the developers. And one option that you product owners have is to write those implementation details into an implementation detail document. The developers can do that during the conversation. You can start doing that. Sometimes the product owner is not a technical person, doesn't have a technical background to actually know what is the right algorithm or how to implement a specific functionality. So typically it's a good practice to have the developers write those implementation details during that conversation about the user story with the product owner. Another example is that a story may be too small or not being vertical. For example, as a Netflix subscriber looking for a new movie to watch, I want to create the UI design of the page with 10 placeholders so that we can decide if the interface design is good or not, and so on. So this is actually pretty messed up as a story. It's describing a task. This is probably a task by the UI designer on the team. It's written from user story point of view, but it's really not a user story. This is a task only specific to one small component of that functionality. So this should really be written in a different format, not as a user story, because it is not vertical. Vertical means that you're going to do the work as a team, and you're going to deliver that functionality when the work is completed. So for example, this is a rewritten example of the user story. As a Netflix subscriber looking for a new movie to watch, I want to see a list of the latest releases so that I can choose a movie to watch and never miss a new release. Now, this story is a functionality that the user can use, is usable once we build it. And in order to build it, we will need work by the UI designer, the software developer, database administrator, the tester, and the system integrator. These are all team members on the Scrum team. They all take this story, work together, and deliver it by the end of the sprint. So this is a much better way to write the user story and also support how the team can work together. All right. And I see a few notes in the Zoom chat and people sharing some comments and so on. That's great. Later on, we will do an exercise together, and also we will do Q&A so we can talk about some of the questions that you may have on some of these topics. Maybe you can offer some other point of view. All right, let's keep looking here. And often we talk about user stories as like an alternative to writing requirements, but let's try to be on the same page. Why Why is that? What is the importance? So first of all, I want to say there is nothing wrong with writing requirements. If you want to work in that way, do that. Okay, if that works for you, that's fine. In general, though, when you work with requirements, requirements are written by the product owner, one-off, and then handed off to the developers for implementation. So there is a one-way handoff between the product owner and the developers. Now, when the developers are unclear about those requirements, they don't fully get it, and so on, they will go back to the product owner asking more questions, and now the product owner needs to iterate on those requirements, rewrite them, extend them, and so on. And then once they have done that, again, send them to the developers for implementation. And the expectation here is that the developers do their work exactly as specified by the requirements. So in general, the requirements are clearly defined in terms of expected solution. The business team, and that is, for example, the product owner, that's the team the product owner belongs to, writes them and then hands over to the development team to implement as is. So there is an expectation of a handoff from the product owner to the developers. Everything is defined upfront, and a change often requires several layers of approvals and change control. And more important, feedback is really sought because we are expected to deliver, the developers are expected to deliver exactly as it is, and there is no like negotiation of the solution, just everything is written, just do as it's written. And if something is missing, I'm gonna add that detail. In fact, typically requirements are written in a long document, which is a product requirement document or PRD. Now, when we work in Scrum with the Scrum team, the user stories shift that approach, shift that process, because the user stories foster collaboration within the team. And in particular, the product owner is now responsible for defining who the user is, what they need, and why they need it, no longer the details of the solution. In fact, the solution itself emerges from that conversation between the product owner and the developers. And this is all part of refinement. So user stories require a process called refinement for really coming up with the solution and the details about the how we're going to implement that. So now when we look, user stories foster a user-centric perspective. Because the solution is not predefined, there is an expectation of a collaboration between the product owner and the developers. They foster collaboration, communication, understanding of the context or the work. These user stories also create a feedback loop because the solution is not predefined up front. It means that we can iterate, we can negotiate, and collaboratively develop a solution for that. User stories deliver the highest value by focusing on small and immediate customer needs. And then they open up a space for innovation and potentially for creative space for new solutions, because again, they don't dictate the solution upfront that is dictated by the business team or by the product owner, but instead they leverage the experience of the entire Scrum team to possibly look at different ideas. That is why we use user stories. Now, with that, let's shift the conversation and let's talk about what happens when a user story is very big. How do we split large user stories into small ones? First of all, there are some benefits in smaller stories. The first, probably most important one, is that a smaller story may fit into a sprint. In fact, if the story is too big for a sprint, the developers cannot work on it. So the product owner needs to work to refine the story, split into smaller stories until the individual pieces can be done in a sprint. the smaller story may deliver an individual functionality of a large story at different times, which allows us also for testing or validating an idea before we do a full commitment of a complete new functionality that may be complex. They accelerate the delivery of value to your customers because now they can start using smaller pieces of functionality instead of waiting for the full thing to be done. Allow you to validate a possible solution to the user needs before going too far, and then estimates become more accurate. In fact, it's easier to estimate a smaller amount, a smaller piece of work, rather than estimating a large story that may be too fuzzy or too complex to really grasp. So let's start with an example. And this is a large story, again, from, let's say, a travel website. As a traveler with a reservation, I want to cancel a reservation and then receive an email confirmation so that I am sure that the reservation has been canceled. Let's assume that for whatever reason of complexity and dependencies and other things, this is estimated to be a big story. It doesn't fit into a sprint. We need to split into smaller pieces. Now, there are different techniques that we can employ to split a user story. I'm going to share a couple of examples using two different techniques so you can see what is the end result of each one. The first technique is called workflow steps, or sometimes it's called paths. The idea here is that you take the point of view of the user, and as the user uses that functionality, they go through multiple steps. So what are the steps that the user takes? The first one is cancel a reservation. So we call it in one story, and that's the first story you see on the left. The second step would be to receive an email confirmation. And that is what you see on the right in the second story. What we have done here is that we have separated these two steps. We have looked at the overall path that the user takes and separated the individual steps. And each step is now an independent user story. We can work on it. We can deliver the functionality without the rest. And the rest can be added later. Each story now is smaller and potentially can fit into a sprint. A different technique could be on the same original user story. It could be to look at what is called the variations of business rules, or sometimes simply rules. For example, in that original story, we may have a different set of customers. For example, we may have a premium member and somebody who is a non-premium member. Or you can think, for example, maybe subscribers and non-subscribers, or things like that. Now, the behavior of the system should be different for one type of user compared to the other. And also what the user can do is going to be different. So now we are splitting that original story into two smaller pieces, calling out the specific for each type of user. As an example, as a premium member, I want to cancel the reservation up to the last minute and receive an email confirmation. As a non-premium member, I want to cancel it up to 3 days in advance and receive an email confirmation. Now, potentially, when we estimate these two stories, the one on the right may be smaller and easier to do than the one on the left. And we may say, why don't we start with the one on the right? Let's support the non-premium members. Let's build that functionality first. And then later, we will add whatever delta it is that we need to support the premium members. And potentially, these two stories are smaller than the original one. So these are two different techniques that we just saw on how to split user stories. Let's take a moment to reflect on a few things here. In particular, this could be very important, what to avoid when splitting stories. First of all, don't split into very small tasks that describe the how, or slice by component. So don't split a story by UI design, database, and coding or testing. These are tasks. Each one of them is not going to deliver usable functionality to the end user. And there will not be a user story. Also, don't slice based on the person that you can assign it to. The user stories are always taken on by the Scrum team, not by a single person on the team. So the Scrum team works on a user story, delivers that user story at the end of the sprint. Typically, a user story requires the work from a few different people on the team. As an example, it could be a software developer and a tester, but it could be other people working on that user story as well. And that is good. That's what we want. So don't slice it down to the individual person, because then again, it may become a task and no longer a user story. And also, I see this as an anti-pattern. I've seen that done by many teams. They try to have stories split into the same sizes. They completely randomly selected a target size of, let's say, 3 points or 5 points. And now they try to have all the stories size at 3 points or 5 or whatever it is. That's not needed. It's just a stretch, and often leads to the other problems I just listed, like slicing by component or by individual person and these kind of things. The point is, as long as a story fits into your sprint, you are good. It doesn't need to be super small or an equal size. And then the most important thing is that the story is usable. It needs to be usable, meaning that once the work on that story has been completed, you can give it to the end user, they can use it. If you just build a database or build an API or build UI design, that is not usable. So that is not a user story. Okay. So now when you do a Google search, for example, you search for techniques or strategies for splitting large stories into smaller ones, you may find a long list of different techniques. I just copied here what are probably the most common techniques. I think these are 12 or 13 techniques. I lost the count. There is also a link there, or a QR code you can scan if you want to visit an article that describes each one in detail. That goes beyond the purpose of today. But the point I want to make right now is that there are many different techniques that you can use. Some of these are very intuitive, very simple to and straightforward to apply. Others may require a little bit of more like technical expertise or more refinement with the developers to be able to do that. The point is, you have different techniques, and depending on the type of user story, depends on the context of the work that you're doing or the specific product, you may choose one or the other. My invitation to the product owners on this call is this. Try to experiment with a few of these techniques. Try to use them, if maybe all of them at some point, and see which one of these is easier for you to apply or easier for you to get the benefit of splitting user stories, which one fits best with the context in which you work. You may end up building your own short list or like a short menu of techniques that you use all the time. And that is a good practice to have. I have mine, I have my preferences, everybody has its own, but the point is, try to use some of these, practice them, experiment. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, not a big deal, but you learn. And then over time, you build your own short menu for things that you like to do. Another example is the spider techniques. This is a short list from the other one. Some of them have slightly different names, but the same concept applies. This is shared by Steve, Mike Cohn at Mountain Goat Software, where the Mike focuses on 5 key techniques. The first one is the spikes. Sometimes when you build a new functionality, you first need to spend some time researching, studying how to build it. Maybe there is a new technology you need to implement. So the story itself is bigger because there is that learning component. You may want to separate it from the story. So call out a spike and the user story separately. Path, split by the steps in the workflow. That's the example I shared earlier. Interfaces, sometimes we build a new functionality and we need to support Android and iOS and web. So now we have 3 different interfaces and we need to build the same functionality for all of this. That adds complexity. Maybe one way to split this big story into 3 smaller ones is to build the functionality first for, let's say, Android only. And then later, we will do that for iOS, and then later for the web, or whatever order you prefer. Data. Sometimes we need to support in the functionality different types of data. And depending on where the data is coming from, the volume or the size of the data, and so on, some of these may be more complex than others. So if you don't need all the data all at once, you can actually split the story into smaller pieces, each one for a specific type of data. Start with the most important one, and then over time, you will support everything. And then finally, rules, like for example, business rules or based on different user types. I gave an example earlier. And here again, you have a link in the QR code if you want to read an article to learn more about how to use these techniques. One example, let's look at a couple of examples together. So there is a story here that is the one you see on the screen on the right. And we're going to use the workflow steps or paths to split this big story into smaller pieces. This applies also when you have a CRUD situation. That's a create, read, update, and delete. For example, a new user account. You can split by each one of these activities. Now, on the story, I'm calling out specifically the steps just to make it easier to explain it. So you see there are 3 steps, but sometimes they are not explicit. You just need to think about it, right? What is the workflow here? And when you split the story, we can call out the first step, which is enter some basic attributes like my funny name and picture. Just call it out as an independent story. And this is much smaller than the original one. Then we will add the second one later, just to pick different genres for movies, TV shows, and documentaries. And then another one to review my choices in case I want to make changes to my profile. So for example, updating the profile can be something that we can add later as a functionality, and that makes each story much smaller than the original one. Another example is the happy or unhappy path. This is a situation. Pretty much in general, when we build a new functionality for the end user, there is an assumption that the end user will use that functionality properly, as we expect them to do. But that's not reality, because customers may not understand how to use it. They may make mistakes. They may enter the wrong information. They may enter the wrong credit card number. They may click the wrong button, and so on. And so what happens when they do this? Now we have all the error conditions. And sometimes the complexity of building a new functionality is not only in building it, but it's also in managing all the different error conditions. That is what we call the unhappy path. So when we split the happy from the unhappy path, we may actually simplify a lot the work that we need to do. That's what we're going to do in this case. So first we separate the happy path, and that's when the father with young kids can set up the parental controls and the PIN. And if you look at the acceptance criteria, the user can enable parental controls, can create and save a PIN, and they need to enter the PIN to modify parental controls. There is no error management here. There is no exception. It just, we expect that the user follows the rules and does this thing. Let's build it. Let's make it work. And then later, we will have a separate story where we manage the unhappy path. That's a similar story, but now if you look at the acceptance criteria, now you see that there are details there about what happens when, for example, the user tries to set up parental controls, but they enter a PIN that is less than 4 digits. As a business criteria, we want 4 digits minimum for the PIN. So now the system, we need to show an error and ask the user to re-enter a longer PIN. Or for example, when they enter the wrong PIN, what happens? So now we are adding all of that complexity of managing the exceptions and the errors in a separate story that makes the first one much smaller. And then finally, I want to talk about defer performance. This can be useful when you have like complexity in a system and you need to deliver performance like response time, security, and these kind of things. And sometimes that the complexity comes from that like performance that we want to achieve. And one way to look at that is that we could actually build the functionality first without performance or without consideration for performance. So let's make it slow, for example. And then later we will add the performance. So an example, I just made an example of Uber. Let's say a passenger requesting a ride. They want to get matched with the nearest car in my vicinity. And we just use geolocation. Geolocation is a very simple thing to account for. And that is very low complexity, especially even when we consider the acceptance criteria with the 1 mile radius from the passenger. So that's an easier story to do than the other one. And that's when not only we have geolocation, but we also want to give a maximum response time to the driver, maximum 30 seconds to accept the request. If I don't, we need to go to the next driver, and then the next driver, and the next driver, until a driver is fast enough to accept the request, and then we come. So intuitively, this requires more complexity than the first story, and we can defer this performance to later. And these are the 3 different techniques I wanted to share with you all today. Then we have one more conversation to do about different story formats. I promise I will do that. My point here is that, just in looking at that question, should we use the user story format for every PBI? And my answer is no. We don't need to use the user story format for every PBI, product backlog item in the backlog. The user story format is optional. You use it when you want to create context about who the user is, what they need, why they need it. But if you have other type of work that doesn't fit or doesn't require that context, don't force a user story format on it. It's like, it doesn't work. So an example of this would be to use the system story. I have a couple of examples here, other format. One is the system story. When you're doing internal work could be technical debt reduction, could be an optimization of the system, could be installing a new framework for software development that the developers need, and all these kind of things. Don't use the user story. There is no end user here, so don't force that format. Instead, use the system story format, and you see an example here. This is straightforward. We know what the work is internal, we get it. Another format is the job story format, and this can be useful in situations where you want to create more understanding of the context of what is happening around the user, and in situation where the end user is pretty clear who that is. Sometimes we have a list of user stories that all look the same because they say, as a whatever user A, as a user A, as a user A, is always the same user in this list of user stories. It's clear who the user is. We don't need to repeat that. Instead, we can use the job story format. As you see here, we assume that we know who the user is, or maybe the user persona. And instead, we want to create context about a specific situation or condition may be happening, and then what the user wants and what benefit they're going to get from it. All right, so these are two alternative there are two alternative story formats that you can use instead of the user story format. And then a couple of notes about acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria are important because they add guardrails and they help to establish quality of the work the developers are doing, and also to reduce ambiguity. Sometimes it's not clear exactly what it is that we need to do, or what the product owner expects, and so on. Let's use the acceptance criteria to be objective and define the expectations of whatever it is that we need to build. So as a definition, acceptance criteria is a set of predefined conditions or standards that must be met so that the work on the story is considered done. In fact, the work on the story cannot be considered done if any one of the acceptance criteria is not met. So all the acceptance criteria need to be met. Which also means, and this is important, which also means that developers should not estimate a user story unless all the acceptance criteria are clearly defined, because the estimate otherwise is completely fuzzy. Acceptance criteria may change later, the estimate changes. So we first need to have all the acceptance criteria defined, and then we can estimate that story. So let's take an example here. Back to the international traveler waiting in the airport. How do you know when the work is done and is done properly? Well, we have a list of criteria. In this case, we have 3 criteria that we need to satisfy. Now, the developers build the functionality, they test it, and one of these criteria does not pass. So this fails, and that story is not done. Now, if you're in the middle of the sprint, no problem. We go back and we try to fix it. And now we test it again, and the story now passes, and we can get it done completed. So that's how we use the acceptance criteria. Now, acceptance criteria follow in 4 different categories in general. One, they describe functional user experience requirements. These are important requirements that you, product owner, want to make sure are true, are satisfied to deliver the right customer experience that you want to deliver to your end users. You may want to call them out into the acceptance criteria. Test conditions. In general, all the acceptance criteria needs to be tested, but there could be some things that we explicitly want to test on the specific user story. We may call it out in the acceptance criteria. There could be some negative scenarios that's connected to the conversation we were having about the happy, unhappy path. For example, what happens when the user doesn't behave the way we expect, when they click the wrong button, when they enter the wrong information? So what kind of error do we want to give? How do we manage the errors, the error messages? What happens when things are unexpected? We need to add all of this in the acceptance criteria. And then there could be some performance or security boundaries or non-functional requirements that also we need to satisfy and account for. So now you see that when you really list all these acceptance criteria, this list can be long. And that list may make the complexity of your story much bigger. That's why we need to have that list of acceptance criteria before we can estimate. So good acceptance criteria. They should be testable. They should be objective, clear, and concise. The objectivity part is very important because if you're not objective, then it becomes subjective and depends on who is doing the test. That is not a good quality practice. Everyone must understand the acceptance criteria because if they don't, then it becomes a problem. They should include functional and non-functional requirements. And then acceptance criteria do not describe implementation details. They do not describe like the specific algorithm to use or whatever, or where do we need to put that button. These are all implementation details that could be written in a separate document. The developers can take the documentation. The acceptance criteria needs to describe the end result. After we have implemented it, how should that thing work or not work? Benefits of good acceptance criteria. First of all, they clarify expectations between product owner and team members so that we avoid any subjectivity or unclear expectations. They establish criteria for testing and Q&A, quality assurance. They define the scope, help to reduce the ambiguity, and defend against scope creep in the middle of the sprint. If an acceptance criteria is missing in the middle of the sprint and you realize that something may be added, they may change the estimate of that user story and now may make that user story no longer feasible in the sprint. Instead of changing the scope, you are better off by adding an enhancement in the product backlog and take care of that in a future sprint. And then establish quality guardrails for the work. One conversation I would like to have is what are the different ways to represent the acceptance criteria, different ways that we can write them. So actually, let's start with this. Consider this story. When I am ready to complete an online purchase on the website, I want to pay with a credit card so that I can complete the checkout quickly. This is written in the job story format. And we want to add some acceptance criteria here. There are 3 different ways that we can write acceptance criteria. The first way is just to create a list. And you see a list here. Each one of these needs to be satisfied. We need to test each one of them, and all of them need to be satisfied for the story to be done. So just create a list, and you see the check mark next to it. A second way to express the acceptance criteria is using a pass or fail test scenario. Basically, you want to describe what is the expected behavior of the system that you need to test. For example, in the first scenario, when name, address, CVV, and expiration date all match, then the expected behavior is that we accept the payment. But in other situations, we may stop and show an error or do something else. So now we are describing the scenario and the expected behavior from the system. And then a third way to express the acceptance criteria using the Gherkin format. Gherkin format is a format that is written in plain English, but is understandable by a machine. So now it allows you to run automatic testing on the work the developers are doing, including automatic testing and regression testing. And there is an example here of the Gherkin format. I used that in another story before as an example, just for additional context. All right, so when is a story considered ready? When can we consider a story ready so we can actually start the work? There are a few criteria here, but I want to call out 2 specifically. One is that the acceptance criteria have been defined. As I said, unless we have a full list of acceptance criteria, we cannot estimate it. So in theory, it becomes difficult to start the work on it because we don't know when the work will be finished. And then is it small enough for a sprint? We spoke about the techniques to split large stories into smaller stories. And that's the kind of test we need to do, right? Does it fit in a sprint? Can we actually get it done? And finally, one last thing I want to share is what is the relationship between acceptance criteria and definition of done. They are the same thing. They apply at different levels. Acceptance criteria are written for each PBI or user story. Definition of done is a global set of criteria. They apply to everything. So now every time you work on a PBI or a user story, that work needs to satisfy both the acceptance criteria defined for that PBI and the global criteria that you have in the definition of done. Otherwise, that story is not completed. All right, with that, we are at the end of our conversation today. Thank you all. Looks like actually most of the time in this conversation. I'll be happy to stay back a few minutes and answer any questions or any comments, these kind of things.